Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate you joining us today for our webinar, the third of three educational webinars sponsored by the United Soybean Board and the American Soybean Association. I'm Sara Wyant, the founder and editor of Agri-Pulse, the nation's leading provider of farm and rural policy information. And we're very pleased to host this important event on a very important topic. Thanks to all of you who are joining us to learn more about infrastructure connecting farmers with the world. As a reminder, if you have questions, and we hope you have a lot because this is a great opportunity to ask them, please submit on the Q&A window on the top right-hand corner of your screen. We'll take questions after opening comments from each presenter. You're going to hear today from two very distinguished individuals and then have that opportunity to ask questions. First up is Alexa Combelic, Director of Government Affairs for the American Soybean Association. Alexa joined the American Soybean Association as Director of Government Affairs just in May, and now she manages a portfolio which includes biofuels, infrastructure, and sustainability policy. So I know she's a very busy woman. Prior to this role, she spent 10 years on Capitol Hill working for Senator Christopher Murphy and most recently as Legislative Director for Congressman Joe Courtney. Welcome, Alexa. Now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sara, for the introduction. I'm glad to be here today to discuss federal infrastructure policy with you. First, for those of you who don't know us, the American Soybean Association, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, represents 30 soybean producing states and over 300,000 American soybean farmers. And here at the American Soybean Association, our farmers care deeply about access to risk management and crop protection tools. They care about continued access to markets, both domestic and internationally, and they care deeply about the issue at hand today, and that's infrastructure and how to get their product to market. And the bottom line is this, that efficient transportation systems make American soybeans competitive on the global market. So this year has been full of a lot of uncertainties, and I think infrastructure legislation certainly follows suit. And here at ASA, we've been really tracking three legislative items related to infrastructure at the federal level, and those are the Water Resources Development Act, or Worda, a surface transportation reauthorization to replace the FAST Act, which expires at the end of this month, and appropriations legislation related to the two, which I won't get into today, given that the government will likely be operating under a continuing resolution posture for the next several months. And looking first at the 2020 Worda bill, we've been fortunate over the past few years to see Congress pass new Worda bills biennially. And Worda is the federal vehicle used to authorize projects and policy that impact our ports, our harbors, and our inland waterways. And agriculture and agriculture-related products represent about a quarter of all cargo that is moved through our inland waterways system. And that's a system that includes nearly 12,000 miles of navigable waters and hundreds of aging locks and dams. And the vast majority of those locks and dams are exceeding their originally engineered 50-year lifespans. In fact, the global competitiveness of the U.S. farmer can be directly tied to the efficiency of transporting product on these inland waterways. So if Congress maintains the status quo of investment in inland waterways infrastructure, delays along the system will continue to grow and will lead to a diversion of cargo to more costly and less fuel-efficient modes of transportation. And unfortunately, the current backlog of authorized inland waterway trust fund projects is growing. ASA believes that our global competitiveness would benefit from additional federal investments to accelerate the completion of these inland waterway infrastructure projects, which is why ASA's top priority in Worda is to adjust the federal cost share ratio of the IWTF authorized projects from an even 50-50 split in funding to a 65%, 35% split. So that's 65% of funding coming from the General Revenue Fund and 35% coming from IWTF dollars. Now, both the House T&I Committee and the Senate EPW Committee have included this ratio change in their bills, and ASA is strongly supportive of this move. So looking forward to the prospect of getting Worda done this year, I think we're optimistic that we'll see this get done in the lame duck. The House passed their Worda bill at the end of July by a voice vote, and the Senate EPW Committee passed a Worda bill out of their committee unanimously in May. So we're hopeful that since this is so bipartisan in nature, that this will keep this bill on the docket for the end of this legislative year. Moving on to surface transportation reauthorization, much like Worda, soybean growers depend on an efficient highway network to move their product in a cost-effective manner. And this webinar has become extremely timely, given that the Senate will be voting on a continuing resolution imminently, and that CR is going to include a one-year extension of the current expiring surface transportation programs through September 30th, 2021. And while we're thankful to see a one-year extension, long-term surface transportation bills are really critical for meaningful investments in our roads and bridges. And state departments of transportation depend on these multi-year, reliable federal funding streams to effectively plan large-scale infrastructure projects. And operating under short-term funding extensions prohibits those meaningful large-scale projects from getting off the ground. And the last point that I will make on surface transportation is that while we're watching, this movement to a one-year extension and then a 5-year reauthorization, hopefully in a year, we're also tracking the Highway Trust Fund shortfall. And back in January of this year, CBO projected that the fund, which already gets additional funding through the Treasury Department, will begin realizing cumulative shortfalls in 2022. And since the impact of COVID-related travel restrictions have been assessed, we're seeing a deepening shortfall from the lower gas tax revenues than previously anticipated. So the CR we expect to see the Senate vote on shortly does include an additional $13.6 billion to shore up the Highway Trust Fund, but moving forward, I think we're all going to be curious to see how congressional leaders seek to address these deepening shortfalls in the Highway Trust Fund in the long term. So why do soybean farmers care about this? I mentioned at the top, efficient transportation systems make American soybeans more competitive on the global market. And since the soybean supply chain is extremely diverse and drawn out, our growers are looking for increasing efficiency across several modes of transportation. And most soybeans spend the first and last 10 to 20 miles of their journey on trucks, which is currently the least fuel efficient mode of transport. But by making these connections to lower cost, more fuel efficient modes of transportation, the soybean supply chain becomes more competitive. And you can see here that the fuel efficiency along our supply chain varies drastically from barge to rail to truck. And so next you can see here the cost of soybeans shipped to Shanghai from 3 different locations. That's Davenport, Iowa, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and the state of Mato Grosso in central Brazil. And you'll notice that while the farm value of soybeans, and that's this green area on each of these bars, is similar for all 3 locations, that the transit cost for American soybeans is really what's keeping us competitive in this global market. So transportation bottlenecks caused by aging infrastructure and stagnant federal investment have a direct impact on our profitability and competitiveness. And that is why this infrastructure legislation that I discussed today remains a top priority for ASA. And with that, I will turn it back to Sara.
Well, thank you very much, Alexa. That's a really great overview to kick us off. Our next panelist is Mike Steenhoek, the Executive Director of the Soy Transportation Coalition. This coalition is an initiative that was established in 2007 and comprised of the United Soybean Board, the American Soybean Association, and 12 state soybean boards. The coalition exists to promote a cost-effective, reliable, and competitive transportation system that serves the agricultural industry. Mike is no stranger to many of you. He's a member of the U.S. Department of Commerce's Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness, the Transportation Research Board's Committee on Inland Water Transportation, and the Iowa DOT's Freight Advisory Council. Prior to his work on the STC, Mike worked for U.S. Senator Charles Grassley for 8 years. So, Mike, we welcome your comments.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and it's just a pleasure to be with you. And to really dovetail with Alexa's comments, which I think did an excellent job teeing up the discussion. One of the things that has really been impressed upon soybean farmers, particularly over the last 15, 20 years, is that profitability for they themselves as farmers and the broader industry should not just be regarded as a function of generating supply, producing a significant volume of soybeans and other agricultural commodities. It's also not a function of stimulating and generating demand, whether it's domestic or overseas. Equal attention and devotion has to also be focused on the connectivity between supply and demand. And that's what our multimodal transportation system does. If you don't have an effective series and inventory of rural roads and bridges, highways and interstates, our freight rail system, our inland waterways, including our locks and dams, as well as our ports, the transaction never occurs. Supply and demand just simply gaze at each other. And so it's critical to have that system that's well financed and well maintained. And it contrasts with how the reality of when my father grew up on a farm in rural Iowa, rural central Iowa. In those days, your customer was located in closer proximity to the farm. So while transportation was certainly important, it wasn't as consequential as it is today. When your customer is located next door, yes, it is important, but when your customer is located halfway around the world, so much of your profitability and the viability of you as an operation and the entire industry is going to be a function of that transportation system. And for soybean farmers, it's particularly acute. This reality is particularly acute given the fact that when you look at a pie chart of how much soybeans are actually consumed domestically or internationally, we have a particular vulnerability to the health or lack thereof of the export market. Over half of what soybean farmers produce is ultimately exported. And so it becomes all the more incumbent to have that transportation system that functions appropriately, that delivers product in a cost-effective, reliable manner. So as a result of that reality, a collection of state soybean associations, along with the American Soybean Association and the United Soybean Board, created this farmer-funded, farmer-led initiative called the Soy Transportation Coalition. And given my background and experience working on Capitol Hill prior to working for the Soy Transportation Coalition, I really understood the goal of the organization, because one of the things that was really one of my takeaways and observations from working on Capitol Hill is there's so often an urban bias or perspective that dominates our decision making and our debates. Infrastructure is one of those issues. And this might be a general statement, but I think there's a lot of reality to it. That when you ask a lot of policymakers, particularly that are Washington, D.C. based, do we have a transportation challenge or dilemma in this country? The answer is always yes. The follow-up question is, how is that transportation dilemma or challenge evident to you? And all too often, the response to that question is long commute times, urban congestion. Have you ever driven the Beltway in Washington, D.C.? Have you ever seen I-95 and how congested it can be? Those are the kind of testimonials you often hear, and it's all too infrequent that you hear a testimonial about the challenges of moving freight, including agricultural freight. So clearly, this is an issue that demands farmer engagement, and that's essentially what we aspire to do, to make sure that that farmer and rural perspective is increasingly incorporated into all of these decisions across those various modes that are important to our industry. To dovetail with Alexa's comments, one of the reasons why we have such an efficient system is that we do a better job in comparison to our competitors in Brazil. And Alexa showed the slide, that cost comparison slide of moving soybeans from a couple US origination points to China versus Brazil to China. And we just do a better job of utilizing those modes of transportation that are well equipped and well positioned to move heavy freight long distances at an economical price point. This slide highlights that the capacity comparison of truck, of rail, and of barge. And when you're able to make better use of freight rail and of the inland waterway system, you are just so better positioned to profit in the international marketplace. We always need to keep in mind that success in agriculture is, and the reality of agriculture is that you have a pretty modest profit margin, but you make your money by multiplying that modest profit margin by millions and billions of bushels. And so having a transportation system that is economical, that can take advantage of economies of scale, is really critical to our success and something that we really emphasize moving forward. Which really tees up well the power of the inland waterway system. And there are a lot of countries around the world that have navigable waterways, rivers that can accommodate commercial traffic. What's unique about the United States is that our inland waterway system, the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Illinois River, the Arkansas River, the Missouri River, our inland waterway system penetrates into the most productive farm ground on the planet. So you have such a wide array of farmers, soybean and corn farmers in particular, wheat to an extent as well, that have access to this very efficient maritime highway. And it's so critical to our success. It's not an accident that the export region down at the lower Mississippi River, between Baton Rouge, Louisiana, past New Orleans to the Gulf of Mexico, that accounts for 60% of U.S. soybean exports, 57% of corn exports. That's by far the number one launching point for both commodities on the international marketplace. So again, really key to our success. One of the projects that I'm just going to highlight, and this is not going to be an exhaustive tour of the various initiatives that the Soy Transportation Coalition works on, but this will hopefully give a nice flavor on each end of kind of the supply chain spectrum, where the exports actually are launched from. And then also we'll talk a little bit about rural roads, rural bridges that are closest to the farm itself. A project that we're very pleased is moving forward and that we have partnered with stakeholders in Louisiana and elsewhere is an effort to deepen the lower Mississippi River from 45 feet of depth to 50 feet in depth. And again, this is that stretch of the river, starts at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's a 256-mile stretch of the river. Baton Rouge, Louisiana goes past New Orleans. New Orleans is River Mile 100. And then it essentially empties into the Gulf of Mexico, essentially at mile 0. Again, there are all of these soybean and grain export terminals located along that lower part of the river. The current water depth it has to be maintained at least 45 feet. And again, there's been this long aspiration to deepen that river from 45 feet to 50 feet. And we as an organization and the soybean family more broadly decided to get more actively engaged in this initiative a couple years ago. And one of the things that I thought was unfortunate is the stakeholders in Louisiana had done an exceptional job of promoting this issue, but I thought Midwestern stakeholders were being quite negligent in providing additional support for that effort. And one of the realities is when you look at our agricultural supply chain and how consequential the lower Mississippi River is the fact that what happens down there along the lower Mississippi River impacts what happens up here in the Midwest. And what happens up here in the Midwest impacts what happens down there. And one of my goals in getting more actively engaged in this project was to ensure that this project was not simply regarded as a Louisiana thing. I thought it also needed to be regarded as an Iowa thing, an Ohio thing, an Illinois thing, a Minnesota thing, a Missouri thing, because of our profitability as farmers were so impacted by this project. So the consequence of being able to deepen that lower stretch of the river from 45 feet to 50 feet is that you'll be able to load approximately 500,000 additional bushels of soybeans per vessel. A typical ocean vessel loaded full of soybeans will accommodate 2.1 to say 2.4 million bushels of soybeans. So adding an additional 500,000 bushels to go up to 2.6 to 2.9 million bushels, it significantly improves the economics of our supply chain. And so that's something that would really enhance our competitiveness. So we decided to get more engaged in this. And one of the things that we did was commission some research. And with the real goal is to be able to better convey how the interior part of the country would benefit from this project and be able to localize it a bit more. One of my other takeaways from working on Capitol Hill was that the micro argument is almost always more persuasive than the macro argument. A lot of times people fall victim to trying to be able to articulate what the global impact of some kind of measure would be. And that makes sense, and that's appropriate to investigate that. But it's always been, in my experience, that the light bulb moment usually goes on when you're able to localize the issue, to be able to talk about how Illinois would impact, how Iowa would impact, how specific farmers would impact. And so that was really one of the main thrusts of this analysis, is to highlight, if we were to deepen the lower Mississippi River from 45 feet to 50 feet, how much more economical would the supply chain be, and how much more of that value would be realized to farmers in the interior part of the country. You see before you on the slide an example of some maps that were produced that show, that's color-coded, and it highlights the price that farmers receive at point of sale for their bushel of soybeans. And if you're in an area that is highlighted in blue or turquoise, that means you are in an area where you're getting a higher percentage of the market value for your soybeans. So let's use round numbers. Let's say soybeans are trading at $10 a bushel at the Chicago Board of Trade. If you're in a blue or turquoise area, you might get even better than $10 a bushel, $10.05 a bushel, or you might be in the discrepancy might be, from a negative perspective, might be more modest. You might be getting $9.95 a bushel. You're in what's called a positive basis or a slightly negative basis territory. If you go to an area of yellow, that discrepancy becomes more wide. And if you're in an area of orange and rust, it becomes wider. So that what that means is farmers in those areas are realizing a smaller percentage of the market value of what they're producing. The map to the right highlights what would be expected once you make the supply chain more efficient by deepening the lower Mississippi River. And what you're seeing is areas of blue start crowding out areas of turquoise, turquoise crowds out yellow, yellow crowds out rust and orange. That means that is a positive basis development. That means farmers are retaining more money in their wallets as a result of that. So we asked the researchers to quantify, when you see that color coding shift, that more favorable trend, try to quantify that. And for the state of Illinois, this is just an example, soybean farmers will receive $77 million each year in addition, not because supply has changed, not because demand has changed, but simply because the supply chain is more economical and more efficient. The aggregate figure for U.S. soybean farmers is $461 million. So a very compelling benefit cost ratio for that project. And this highlights how we did highlighted different states. This is the state of Ohio. Similar kind of trend. Ohio, you would see $34 million for additional value for soybean farmers. And we have maps for all of these various soybean producing states that show a similar trend. So we were very pleased that we did this research. We partnered again with the organizations and the stakeholders in Louisiana and the New Orleans area in particular to really promote this, and it really became a true collaborative effort. And one of my favorite statements is that we projects are always more successful than me projects, and this was a great example of a we project. And so with the soybean industry, with the stakeholders in Louisiana being engaged, we were able to promote this project. The United Soybean Board provided $2 million of funding to help underwrite the non-federal cost share of this project. This is a project that is 75% the responsibility of the federal government, 25% the responsibility of non-federal entities. The state of Louisiana is the identified non-federal stakeholder responsible for this. So the soybean farmer funding via the United Soybean Board is contributing to that 25% non-federal responsibility. So a really good example of a public-private partnership with federal government, with state government, with soybean farmers who are among the ultimate beneficiaries of that. So, and then working also with the American Soybean Association and state soybean associations and others, we were able to effectively get this project included on what's called the Army Corps of Engineers' work plan. So that means that the project got the green light on July 31st, and this is the picture on the slide. The governor of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards, the Army Corps of Engineers, they had a signing ceremony that officially kicked off the project. And then on September 11th, it was reported to me that the actual deepening had commenced. So this project is underway. This first phase of the project again, it's underway. It'll be completed by fall of 2021. And this will ensure a 50-foot or greater channel for the first 154 miles of the lower Mississippi River. And again, essentially, without splitting hairs, where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico, that's mile 0. New Orleans is mile 100. So this will extend to mile 154. 11 of the 14 soybean and grain export terminals are located within that first 154 miles. So a pretty immediate benefit to that supply chain once it's completed. And then it'll take another 2 to 3 years to complete that remaining part of the channel deepening from that mile 154 to Baton Rouge. It becomes more complicated once you get north of mile 154 because there are some oil pipelines that are buried underneath the river. Those need to be identified, which ones need to be moved, and then actually moving those pipelines. And then the river is more serpentine north of mile 154, so there's more sediment buildup. So it's more of an exhaustive process. But again, having that completed by the end of 2024 is very likely. So again, this is a project that we're very pleased with and see it move forward. And again, it will have consequence to soybean farmers throughout the country. Shifting again to the other end of the supply chain, we also need to be engaged in rural road and bridge issues, and an initiative that we have underway that will be publicly released fall of this year is we are going to be highlighting the top 20 innovative concepts for replacing and repairing rural bridges. And it's always a good day to promote the greater stewardship of the taxpayer dollar. It's particularly a good day to do so when you have almost every state, and perhaps every state in this country, struggling with an unexpected and significant decrease in fuel tax revenue. Alexa mentioned, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an unexpected decrease in the amount of driving in this country. And as a result of that, there is obviously less fuel consumed. And as a result of that, less fuel tax revenue populating both the Federal Highway Trust Fund and the individual state funds as well. And so we will be promoting this concept of ways that you can replace and repair rural bridges for a fraction of the cost. And it's quite common for a rural short span bridge to cost $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. Some of these concepts that all of these concepts that we will be promoting will have at least a 25% cost savings for each of them. And some of them are even more profound than that. Some of these concepts, like the one that you're seeing on the left part of the screen, that's a rural bridge that was produced by taking two retired railroad flat cars and bolting them together and creating a rural short span bridge that meets all of the engineering criteria and meets all of the safety criteria. But a bridge like that is going to cost about $100,000, $120,000. So a fraction of the cost of some of the prevailing way of replacing these bridges. And what we've done is we've assembled a group of 13 engineers from across the 13 Soy Transportation Coalition states to weed out and to arrive at this list. So these are all innovative engineers who are acquainted with some of the new technology and innovations, but for a variety of reasons, some of these good ideas aren't being widely implemented. One of my takeaways is that when you have a good idea, but it can be quite frustrating, you don't see that good idea implemented or embraced, it's usually due to one of three reasons. Number one, it's due to a lack of awareness of that good idea. Number two, it's due to a lack of understanding of that good idea. So there might be some kind of faint acquaintance with the idea, but you don't really understand why it's so consequential. But I think number three, the main reason why you see a lack of embracing good ideas is a lack of motivation. So a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding, but I think most consequently, a lack of motivation. It's quite common in rural areas that people are just set on, this is the way I've always done it, and so I'm not really open to some of these new and innovative concepts. We as a farmer organization, I think we can really play a meaningful role in this. And I think one of the things I appreciate about farmers is it's a part of their brand ID to accomplish just as much, if not more, with a given amount of resources. And the farmers that I have the pleasure of working with, when they have some kind of need or challenge on their farm operation, their default position is not to say, well, let's find a way for me to spend more money. Their default is always, let me try to find a way to achieve this without spending a lot more money, to do more with less, to be innovative. And so we think that we're going to be a very effective messenger, incredible messenger for this. So to make this list, it has to really meet all three of the following criteria. Number one, has to be valid from an engineering perspective, and we'll have the citations for that. So whether it's been approved by the Federal Highway Administration, Ohio State University, some kind of credible entity. So that's number one. Number two, it has to provide notable cost savings. And again, we're looking at least 25% or greater. Number three, we want to make sure that this is going to be widely accessible across rural America. So that's really key as well. So, and again, there'll be 10 concepts related to bridge replacement, 10 concepts related to bridge repair. And the concept, the photo to the right is another one that we will be featuring most likely. And it's a way of replacing bridges for a fraction of the cost. It can be done with a local crew. You don't have to hire an expensive firm to do it. It's called Geosynthetic Reinforced Soil Integrated Bridge System, GRS-IBS, and it was first developed by the Federal Highway Administration. It's being successfully used in certain areas of the country, but we think it needs to proliferate throughout the country. So that I'm going to keep my prepared comments to that. I just want to, just a kind of a final thought is that there's really no reason why farmers, given how distant they are from our coastal regions, there's no reason why they should be international entrepreneurs. Farming really should be, you would argue, a local parochial small business. But because we have this multimodal transportation system that can effectively connect what farmers produce with these international customers, farmers in the middle of the country can regard themselves as international entrepreneurs. And we have had this transportation system that has allowed that to occur. That's the good news. The bad news is that the United States can increasingly be described as a spending nation and less of an investing nation. And there's a profound difference between the two. And so one of the key messages that we and others try to transmit is that we need to recapture that investment mentality that has provided us so much benefit in the past. And if we do so, it will provide benefit into the future and allow us to be competitive well into the 21st century. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Sara.
Well, thank you, Mike. And I'd like to, again, welcome some questions. We've got quite a few that are in the queue already. So we're going to start with that. But as Chuck pulls all three of us back into view, Mike, I'd like you to share with everybody where they can find the research that you've done on the dredging, the economic benefits. And so if people want to look at that per each soybean growing state, where can they find that?
Yeah, you can just simply go to our website at soytransportation.org, and it's listed right on the main page.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, we do have some questions coming in already. One from Julie Harker at Brownfield, who is very familiar with some of the frustrations that we've had on the Missouri River. She notes that Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and Kansas lawmakers have been asking the Corps of Engineers to direct more resources to help with the lower Mississippi River basin. She would like you both, because I know you both have recently been engaged on this, to talk about what's going on with the ability to perhaps deploy more resources there. And also, she wanted to know if there's been some challenges presented by more accidents with barges on the river. So Alexa, if you'd like to start, and we'll have Mike contribute to that as well.
Sure, and I think she's referring to the Missouri River, the lower Missouri River, where it feeds into the Mississippi River.
Yes,
is that correct? Yeah, okay. There was a lot of flooding, I think, in 2019 there that caused excessive shoaling in the area, and then now we're seeing excessively low water levels there. So there's an increased need for funding from the Army Corps for navigation repair in that area. So we have farmers from those 4 states that rely on that waterway to get their product to market after harvest. And, without the ability to use it efficiently, it's going to cause some issues in the supply chain. Mike?
One of the things that I think is unfortunate is that there are a lot of farmers in western Iowa, eastern Nebraska, parts of South Dakota, eastern Kansas, lots of parts of Missouri, that while they have proximity to the inland waterway system, they have very little access to the inland waterway system. And there's a big difference between the two. Proximity simply means you're close to something. Access means you're able to drive utility and benefit from that something. And so there's all these farmers that are located close in proximity to the Missouri River, but they don't have effective access to it. And as a result, they are at a disadvantage compared to some of these farmers that are located closer to, say, the Mississippi or the Ohio rivers. The Missouri River will never rival these other rivers in terms of volume of freight moves, but I and others argue that it should be more widely considered and embraced as a supply chain option for agriculture and for others. I believe that the reputation of the Missouri River is worse than its actual potential in terms of navigation. And so we think that the federal government should devote more predictable resources to managing and maintaining that navigation channel. Unfortunately, there has been a bit of a chicken versus the egg dynamic that has settled in related to the Missouri River. The federal government has on many occasions said over the years, why should we invest in the Missouri River? Because we don't see a whole lot of utilization of the Missouri River. And potential utilizers will say, well, we don't plan on using the Missouri River until we see a greater financial commitment by the federal government toward the Missouri River. So we have kind of this chicken versus the egg dynamic that has settled in. One of the things that's been really encouraging to me is that despite all of this, we are seeing more of an enthusiasm for the Missouri River. Just a couple weeks ago, I attended a groundbreaking on the Missouri River north of Council Bluffs, Omaha, south of Sioux City, Iowa, for a new barge loading and unloading facility by a company called New Cooperative. That's a farmer-owned cooperative based in Fort Dodge, Iowa. And they plan to load barges full of soybeans for the export market yet this fall of 2020. You're seeing more movement out of places like St. Joseph, Missouri, the port of Kansas City. So you're seeing more of that. But again, we need to continue to really advocate for the Missouri River as a navigation option. The bad news about the Missouri River is that there are no locks and dams. So you don't have that 9-foot channel that these locks and dams are able to provide, say in the Mississippi or the Ohio rivers or Illinois. The good news, though, is that there are no locks and dams. And so you can provide significant benefit with a more modest amount of federal resources toward the Missouri River, and you can get a lot for a much more modest amount of money. So again, that's something that we're going to continue to be engaged in.
Thank you. Another question came in to me via text on my phone from our own Ben Nully asking about Worda. And as you mentioned, Alexa, it really was not controversial, passed the House, it's moved through Senate committee. But there's and there is consideration that it will possibly move in the lame duck. But there's also a lot of talk about, and of course, we don't know who's going to win the election, who's going to win the Senate, what might happen if there's a new Democratic president. The Senate is controlled by Democrats. There's some discussion moving around that there's going to be another big stimulus package and that perhaps Worda might be moved into that next year. Is that what you're hearing, or can you give us an update on how Worda might or might not be moved into either the lame duck or into a new stimulus package?
Sure. It's my understanding that the Senate and the House have been in discussions on a conference agreement on Worda. There's a few hangups left. I don't foresee a situation in where it happens before the election, but it's certainly one of the few pieces of legislation that I think really has a chance of moving in the lame duck. One of the beauties of Worda is that there are a lot of small projects in there that benefit specific districts. So you have folks all around the country that are fighting to get this bill done before the end of the year, both inland and coastal members. So my fingers are crossed. I really hope it does get done, but I think there's a lot of bipartisan hunger to get that done before the end of the year.
Thank you. A question for you, Mike. Actually, a couple questions I'll combine here. One of our viewers wants to know if from this additional dredging, there's an environmental impact on the river that needs to be considered. I'm sure there's been a lot of environmental impact studies, but if you could share any environmental considerations. And then another person asked whether or not the sediment that is dredged from there, what happens to that material and where does it go?
Yeah, excellent question. For this project to proceed, one of the critical elements was for the Army Corps of Engineers to issue what's called a Chiefs report. And a part of that Chiefs report is assessing the environmental consequences of this project. And the chief's report did determine that there are no adverse environmental consequences of this project. One of the benefits of this is there is every year for decades, there has been maintenance dredging work in this area of the lower Mississippi River. So this is not dredging this part of the river is not a hypothetical. It's something that we have a long track record of observing what the consequences are for years. What this project will essentially do is expand on the maintenance dredging by deepening it at an additional 5 feet. There's just certain parts of the river where it's more apt for sediment buildup, and one of the areas where you see that most routinely is near the Gulf of Mexico at an area called Southwest Pass, and so that's going to be the area that's going to be attended to. I think one of the most compelling components of this project is the environmental story, is the dredge material that is excavated from the maintenance dredging, but even more so with the deepening project, is pumped off to the side of the shipping channel. And those in southern Louisiana describe it as the largest wetlands reclamation project on the planet. And I see no evidence that they're wrong. There has been thousands of acres of wetlands that have been reclaimed and will be expanded as a result of this project. New wildlife habitat is being restored. Bird habitat is being restored. So from a wildlife habitat perspective, there's a real positive story to tell. But then also, Louisiana has really been struggling for years on the degree of shoreline erosion that has occurred and will continue to occur for the foreseeable future. What this project, it won't reverse that, but it will certainly mitigate that. They are very concerned with the resiliency of their shoreline. And so here's a way to help mitigate that to an extent. So very compelling story to tell from an environmental and wildlife perspective on this project.
That's terrific. And one other questioner from Indiana Soybean wants to know, you talked about completion moving into 2021. Will there be some benefits for some farmers in some regions before that time period?
Yeah, the farmers that are closer to the river will receive more of the immediate benefit. When you have that barge to ocean vessel supply chain become more economical, those who really feed into that will notice the more immediate impact of that. But one of the things that we're excited about is by making this barge to ocean vessel supply chain more economical, you create more demand for and more of a willingness to drive your soybeans or your corn via truck to the river. You're more willing to travel larger distances because if there's 3 essential steps from the farm. There's 1, the truck movement. Step 2 is the barge movement. Step 3 is the ocean vessel movement. By deepening the lower Mississippi River, you're going to make step 3, the ocean vessel movement, more economical. So as a result, there's going to be a greater willingness to incur some additional costs at step number 1, the truck movement, in order to access the river because it'll be recovered at step number 3. What that'll do is it'll create more modal competition between barge and rail. It'll create more of an overlap between these 2 modes. And from a shipper perspective, we see repeated evidence that when you have modal competition between modes of transportation, the freight rates are more competitive and more economical for you as the shipper. So we think that's one of the other benefits. So even if you're further removed from the river, you will see benefit as well in the form of more competitive rail rates.
That's interesting. So another reporter has asked a question. Janine Otto asked about the status of the soybean container shipment project and where will the bulk of those containers move to, either New Orleans or the PNW? I assume, Mike, you're familiar with that?
I mean, there's I guess there are a couple things. Number 1 is there's an increasing desire among our industry and others to utilize containerized shipping of soybeans, and for a variety of reasons, greater quality preservation. You're able to have greater identity preservation. There's this desire to have more of a localized supply chain among our international customers. And so it's something that we've been exploring and promoting. I don't see a time where containerized shipping will exceed the amount that's moved by bulk, whether rail or by barge. We have 7% of our exports leave from containers. So bulk will always be the predominant way that we move things. But we think the slice of the pie chart that says containers, we think it would be great if it were to grow. So it's something we continue to monitor. One of the projects that's a part of this overall effort is a new vessel concept that doesn't exist yet, but it will likely exist in a couple years, that's designed to transport containers on the inland waterway system. So what you essentially would have is these large ocean vessels coming into southern Louisiana by New Orleans, loaded into these new vessels that can transport containers on the inland waterway system. They would go up to some of these metropolitan centers like St. Louis, like Memphis, like the Chicagoland area, offload their consumer goods that are originally destined for these population centers. And then that provides an opportunity for soybeans or for DDGs or some other kind of agricultural product, soybean meal, to be loaded into those empty containers for the backhaul movement, most likely to Asian customers. And so that's something that we continue to work on. And so we would love to see more of this localized supply chain in the future.
Thank you. Alexa, a question for you. You talked about the funding formula, the 65% versus 35% from the Inland Waterway Trust Fund. One of the things that I think so many people that are dependent on these funds, these private public funds, is the fact that so many of these funding revenues are generated from vehicles that use gas or renewable fuel. And as we look at a lot of different folks moving to electric, and even the state of California, the governor just said, we want to move to all electric vehicles in the next 15 years or so. What's the discussion going on Capitol Hill, if at all, about how maybe some of these funding formulas have to change so that we can still generate revenue for our roads from different kinds of vehicles than we've had in the past?
Yeah, I think that's been a conversation that's been ongoing on Capitol Hill for quite some time. And, I think that we are going to continue to see, as you mentioned, hybrid vehicles, electric vehicles. There is going to be less reliance on gas and therefore less revenue going into the Highway Trust Fund. Same when you talk about the user fees for barges. But I think that, we've talked about on the Hill creating user fees on roads, sort of more like a tolling type system. But there's going to have to be some sort of conversation as reliance on petroleum goes down as to how we can maintain a state of good repair and invest in infrastructure, without that crutch that we've been using to fund all of these things for so long. I'm sure that Mike has a lot of thoughts on this as well.
And we've seen more energy on this and more accomplishment at the state level. It's not foreign to anyone that there's just much more dysfunction and acrimony in Washington, D.C. that's really preventing, thoughtful things getting accomplished. So, for example, since the year 2013, I believe, there's been 36 states that have actually voted to increase their fuel tax. A number of states, I know Iowa just this last year, 2019, they did something related to alternative vehicles. So there's an actual fee that if you're an electric vehicle, you own an electric vehicle, there's a fee associated with that, and they try to basically make it equivalent to what your average person would pay in the form of a gasoline tax. and then there's a fee associated with that to your registration. And they have something similar for hybrid vehicles. The state of Indiana did that, something very similar a few years ago, and we're seeing more and more of that at the state level. It'd be great to see something similar at the federal level, but again, it's obviously harder to see something like that achieved.
Yes, especially in a year divisible by 4. Some of these discussions become a lot more polarized. So we're just down to about our last couple of minutes here, and I had one more question for both Mike and Alexa. And Mike, I'm going to turn to you first because this is personal. Our farm in North Dakota has a bridge right next to it along the Heart River, and they've notified everybody in the area that it's been downgraded. It's going to have to be replaced. We can't put heavy farm equipment across it anymore. And in the reality, there's only a few people and the mailman that use it every day. It just brings to life this idea about how do you prioritize. There's obviously farm to market roads that are usually identified in each county, but how do you prioritize what's going to get fixed? And I'm certainly glad to see you've got some lower cost options under consideration, but how do people go about that prioritizing the resources?
Yeah, and that's one of the main inspirations behind this project, because if we put all of our hopes on the federal, state, or local government writing a bigger check, we're going to be a very disappointed group of people. And so you have to just not only focus on the revenue side of the equation, but also on the cost side. And so that's one of the inspirations behind this project. It clearly is difficult when you're talking about some of these rural bridges that receive very little vehicular traffic. And I understand that there's a point where you do have to prioritize. One of the things that we really try to do, though, is challenge how do you evaluate and arrive at use. And the predominant way that's done is you put some kind of meter over a stretch of road, and you count the number of tires that go over that stretch of road in a given period of time. And if there's more tires that go over that meter, that determines greater use. Well, one of the things I try to challenge is, what's greater use? 10 cars going over a stretch of road, or 2 semis that are transporting 900 bushels of soybeans going over that same stretch? But the fact that that delivery occurred resulted in a real economic ripple effect that's providing benefit to the broader community. How do you define use? And so I think that's something I continue to challenge on, is let's make sure that we're finding an appropriate way of defining use. But clearly, the reality is there are some really difficult discussions that are happening at that local level for those bridges that have just a few, people using it on a given day. But again, that's why we really try to stress there are economical options available to replace that bridge without compromising safety that are at a fraction of the cost.
Thank you. And Alexa, I know your association has had 100 years of history and advocating on behalf of soybean farmers. So in the last minute we've got left here, if you had a couple of things that you'd like your members to really focus on in Congress relative to these issues, how can they be better advocates?
Sure. I think on the Water Resources Development Act, we're really eager to see that cost share adjustment. That's going to be really big for our farmers. The Senate version of this bill right now does not have a sunset date on that change in the cost share ratio, but the House version does. So I think, advocating for that Senate provision is something that we're really looking forward to working on after the election and the lame duck. And then additionally, I think just reminding folks that a long-term surface transportation reauthorization, it's going to actually give those state DOTs the ability to prioritize these smaller projects, right? It will give them that funding stream, that assurance that they do have the money available to work on some of these rural roads and bridges that maybe they wouldn't feel that they had the ability to do with short-term one-year reauthorizations.
Thank you very much for that. And thanks to both of you. You just did a great job covering a lot of different issues and some new initiatives that you've got going on. And we'd really like to thank both the United Soybean Board and the American Soybean Association for sponsoring this webinar. I hope all of you continue to pay attention to these issues, and I'd like to wish you good luck and a very good rest of your day. Thank you.